All right. Welcome to Front End First. Today we're going to be talking about WordPress.
We have a special guest joining us.
We do not have a special guest, although we're both special. Today we actually want to talk about open source software and self-hosting. So there's been a lot of good conversation going around Twitter lately about Next.js, and we're users of Next. We're big fans. We know a lot of the people who work on Next and admire the team there and everything Next has done. And I don't remember exactly how this got kicked off, but there's been lots of conversation going around about hosting Next, self-hosting Next, deployment platforms, things like Cloudflare and Fly and all these other options. And just kind of the lines between application architecture and infrastructure. So we've had some fun conversations just about everything going on there and figured we'd want to talk about it.
Yeah, I think kind of just to get right into it, I think there's like this question, I see this come up all the time, is Next.js self-hostable? And there's all these different answers for it, and there's all these different caveats and blah, blah, blah. I think just to kind of like just jump right to the conclusion, it is self-hostable. We've self-hosted it. We have clients that self-host it. So it's definitely like, don't think that it's not self-hostable. But the discussion, this is sort of the discussion that always comes up with Next.js. Someone goes to self-host it, they run into some sort of problems, and their immediate reaction is this is not self-hostable. And so that's what we wanted to talk about.
Yeah. And I think to set the stage, I think what we like to do on this show is kind of like to think of ourselves as like almost like doctors and trying to diagnose the problem and just look at it kind of charitably from all sides instead of trying to take a side about an opinion or judgment about what should or should not Next or other platforms or other hosting providers do. We think there's an interesting nugget here just to talk about how frameworks have evolved, how infrastructure has evolved, and how those lines have changed over the years from things like Heroku, to what we have today. And so regardless of what you think about, Next or Vercel or Cloudflare or Remix or whatever tech stack that you're a fan of, this is more just kind of like we're trying to have a value neutral conversation about this interesting piece here, which is just this blurred line between infrastructure and application architecture. So let's kick it off with talking about Heroku. I think that's a good place to start in the 12-factor app.
Yeah. Let's go there.
Cool. So Heroku came out as one of like the main first, managed hosting providers for Rails apps back in the day. What was it? 2012, maybe something like that. Maybe earlier.
Oh, earlier. Yeah. I think
earlier.
2008, 2009.
Cool.
Sometime in between 2008 and 2012.
But for the purpose of this conversation, I think the interesting thing about Heroku was that it enabled you to take your Rails app, which was running on localhost, and push it to the internet, right? Git push Heroku master. That was like the main thing. And that was a big deal back then because there was nothing like that really existed, or nothing that was popular like that. As part of like Heroku coming on the scene, they had to educate developers how to build an app, a Rails app that was hostable on Heroku. And I think it was the founder who had this document called the 12-factor app. And the 12-factor app had a set of constraints that if you made your Rails app in such a way that respected those constraints, they could guarantee that you could take a Rails app that was running on localhost and they'd be able to deploy it. And so what are some examples of those factors? For example, not accessing the file system directly, right? Because when Heroku came out, that was like a new part of the model. So just as a very concrete example, you have a PHP or a Rails app and you want to upload a file to it. So you make an upload file feature. You can add a picture. It's very easy in Rails or PHP to write a handler that takes in a file and just saves it on disk. And Heroku obviously had a constraint because they wanted to be able to spin up and spin down servers that that kind of durable storage was not part of your application server. So this is an example of one of the 12 factors. It was a constraint that you took on. You gave up the ability to write to the file system. And the benefit that you got for making sure your code didn't do that is that you could deploy it to Heroku. So there was a bunch of other these factors, but they basically all kind of revolved around this idea of like your application server being stateless, separating anything that needed to be durable and long-lived to, you know, things like a database server or S3 to use for file storage. Yeah, at the time, this was like a really interesting conversation because not only did people want to be able to use Heroku, it also just felt like there were some good constraints to have. It kind of helped us think about how to write apps in this way. And it was clear that this was the direction that the infrastructure was moving. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I also want to say that many websites were being built like this. But it was kind of like it's just, oh, that's a best practice. These are best practices. Where this was more of a, if you follow these 12 factors, you will be able to deploy to our platform and look at all these benefits you get. Look at all this scalability. And it was also, it was reading these, you're like, okay, yeah, these make sense. Like I can do these in my apps. I see the benefits I get. And they're probably things like I may have already been doing most of them. It wasn't like a completely new, like, whoa, I need to unlearn everything.
Right.
So I felt like there was a really good, you understood what they were asking you to do. You might have already been doing it, and the benefits were really clear.
Yep. So yeah, for the purpose of this conversation, I think that's like the interesting, the important part is that these factors were things that you gave up because you wanted a benefit. And it was clear that that was the trade-off you were making. Okay, now let's flash forward to something like Netlify or even like Jekyll. I think this is an interesting example.
What is Jekyll?
Jekyll is a static site generator. I think it was from Tom Preston Warner, the co-founder of GitHub and creator of the TOML language and a bunch of other stuff. But it was like one of the first popular static site generators, right? This is kind of an example of the same conversation because if you had a site that was mostly static, like a blog, and it was public, didn't have any data that needed to be updated very often on a request by request basis, you could write it in Jekyll and Jekyll would generate a static version of your site. You could use Ruby to dynamically do something like query database or query the file system and get all of your posts from Markdown and turn them into HTML files. But at the end of the day, if you ran Jekyll build, you got a static site. And what did that get you? Well, in the beginning, it got you onto GitHub Pages. If you can put a Jekyll app into GitHub, then we can host your app for free. And it'll be static and it'll be fast. And that's kind of like, if you squint your eyes, it looks a lot like Heroku, right?
Sure. Yeah. Keep going. Yeah.
So these are like constraints. These are the factors, right? What's the constraint that you take on to get the benefit that the hosting infrastructure provider can give you? Well, if I don't need a site that changes on every request, if I write a blog post once a week, then I can put it into GitHub, and now GitHub can host it for free. And it can be fast, it can be free, it's static, I don't need any resources. That was like the agreement.
I would say here, this is like, we're talking about frameworks as well as hosts. So like Heroku's a host, but Jekyll is a framework. The framework here is telling you if you build your app in a certain way, you can now deploy it to. It's a lot easier to deploy. You don't need You don't need a process. You don't need CPU. You don't need memory. You can push it up to some static site server. GitHub Pages offered free static site hosting, and so if you author your app in this way, you can include dynamic data like reading from Markdown files, but you have to do that at build time.
Right.
And then what do you get for this? Well, you get easy deployment, base free hosting off GitHub. And so I think this is a good example of like the framework is nudging you towards a very specific architecture that gets to take advantage of cheap infra.
Right. Exactly. Whereas Heroku maybe didn't feel like that. Heroku's factors maybe didn't feel like they were as prescriptive in terms of the application code you had to write. Maybe you had a Rails app that saved a file, but if you wanted to use Heroku and that was the only factor that you were violating, you could switch to Amazon S3, and you didn't have to change much else about your application architecture and your code.
Yeah, it was also like a boundary. You can still write files. You need a shared file system that's going to be available between deployments. They're saying like we're going to give you a file system by default. It's going to be ephemeral. It's going to reset every time the container turns off and on. If you want persistent storage, well, that's something you have to attach, and you have to figure out how to do that. And they were great with like having a whole bunch of integrations and all this stuff. And they were great at the like. We use file systems for uploads. They're great at having like, here's how you do it with S3. Look how much easier this is. But yeah, they are telling you. I guess we should talk about the benefit too. The benefit of Heroku is you get a slider, and if your site is getting a lot of traffic, you just drag that slider all the way up, and all of a sudden you go from running one app server or two app servers to you're running 7 or 8 app servers now. And that was pretty magical. It was pretty amazing.
It was super magical. I remember people tweeting about it and being like, we're getting a spike from Hacker News, and we have to get all of our guys to SSH into our server and provision more resources. And then now after Heroku, the guy was sitting back and he's like, oh, give me 1 second. It's going to take a while. And he logs in the dashboard and he drags the slider up. And now you got like whatever, 8 CPUs added, all this extra memory. So that was super magical.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember, like, I think definitely around the time there were like, I was working with some people that did want to write stuff to disk, like did want to throw like a CSV file on disk and later for processing. And I remember it being kind of hard to convince them that like, okay, well, we need to find some other way to do this. So it definitely like, yeah, when you like, I think it's fair to say like a lot of container deployments have won these days, and it's not like a battle you have to pick over like ephemeral file systems. But yeah, at the time I remember that being somewhat difficult. So I'm trying to think like
it's a good point, because the point being that it's about this conversation is about trade-offs, what you're giving up and what you're getting. And that's something that's different for every app, every developer, every team. And there's no solutions. There's only trade-offs. So,
and if we tell people they can scale their app when they get on Hacker News, and the guy that is running a back office app that's used by one person that processes CSV files, they're going to tell you they don't care.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Yep. Okay, so let's jump forward. So we have Jekyll, which is kind of like a static site generator. And then we have, React and SPAs getting popular. And we have platforms like Netlify coming out, and JAMstack architecture, which you can kind of see as an evolution, right? You can put your Jekyll site up if you can live with the constraint, if you can give up the request time dynamic data. If you have a site that doesn't need that, you get a lot of benefits like cheap free hosting. It's really fast. And so people want to start blurring the lines here. And you have a dynamic site, but maybe it's expensive to host, or you want to speed it up somehow. So there's a version of like the the Jekyll architecture where if you can get some pieces static or some pieces more static and tolerate some staleness, you can do like this JAMstack thing where you do a static version of your site and then you kind of like hydrate interactivity later or you update things later.
I
And
think, I think a like concrete example of this is static version of the site, and then when the browser loads, the user's browser starts making fetch requests for the data that they need.
right.
So this lets you get dynamic data at runtime. Before
Right.
Jekyll was only build time, dynamic data at runtime, but yeah, still statically hostable. Yep.
Right. So, and this is kind of where, you know, we have Next entering the scene, other frameworks that support this model. Basically, if you look at the Rails app from 2010, it is a request response app. Every time a request comes in, Rails generates the response. You have the full power of the server, the database, to create every single response. But now there is a new factor, a new constraint, which is if you can separate the static and dynamic parts, then here's what you get. And if you author your code in such a way that does that, or use a framework that does that for you or helps you do that, here are the benefits that you get. You can get like a fast initial load time. You can get, maybe it's cheaper hosting, or maybe it's being able to use serverless, which is has other benefits. So if you don't want to drag the slider, we now have this new infra development called serverless, and it has constraints, but it solves certain problems. It auto scales, let's say. So you don't have to log in when Hacker News hits and drag the slider. We have a technology that does that for you. But in order to use it, there's certain constraints. So just wanted to set the stage there because all of these things, this is like how we're thinking about all of these different knobs and levers. And, you know, I think we both think that sometimes it gets lost in the conversation, especially when like the opinions come out in terms of like what's best, what's worse. I think both of us would even say like, you can't really, we're not interested in passing a judgment about whether writing a Rails or PHP app that doesn't do file uploads is better than one that does, right? It's just different, and you're giving up something and you're getting something. So yeah, that brings us to Next.js, and let's talk about Next.js and what it looks like to host it on Vercel, what kinds of things you get from it, and what it looks like to self-host it, and why this conversation started and why it can be confusing to understand whether it's self-hostable or not, and what we mean by that. Let's just think about some of the stuff that came up in our conversations the last week or so. I guess at a top level, Next has guides about self-hosting it. And basically you can run npm run next serve or npm run start. And that serves a Next app. And so if you have like a node server and you have a Next app, you can run npm run start and it'll serve your app. So that means it's self-hosted, right?
I mean, yes. I think when we talk about frameworks that nudge you to doing something to take advantage of a certain architecture, we should talk about the things that Next.js nudges you towards. So Next.js, Next.js has a whole bunch of options, but one is they want you to statically generate pages at build time as much as you can. And then they give you little ways to like invalidate those pages as they change. So you don't have to go off and like rebuild your entire app. You can do it on like a per page basis. The other thing too is if you can like statically generate pages, you can push those pages out to CDNs. So the requests don't, since it's just static, the requests don't have to flow to an origin server. They can be handled by something on the edge. Some CDN layer can return the HTML, and then yeah, you can fetch dynamic data using the browser. And there's also newer stuff with React 19 that can improve on this. But let's just the framework that nudges you towards that architecture, you kind of have to have that architecture, right? Like you have to have that architecture. So if you're talking about self-hosting as running a node server and sending requests to it, I think there's a question like, is there a gap? Like, is this the equivalent of deploying an app to Heroku, but never dragging the slider past one because you're writing to that ephemeral file storage, and if you spin up 2 app servers, they're gonna have 2 different ephemeral file storages, and they won't like see each other. So something like I'm just throwing that out there.
That's a great analogy. I think if you look at the 12 factors from Heroku, the question is how much did they change your Rails apps? And you could even just zoom forward 10 years and squint and look at all the Rails apps and say, how many of these are just hostable on Heroku, even if they're not being hosted on Heroku? How different would a Heroku hostable Rails app look from a non one? And I think today they probably look very, very similar, right? Most Rails apps are probably hostable on Heroku without changing anything at all. Whereas
yes,
the Jekyll thing, if you say how many blogs, how many personal blogs are hostable on GitHub Pages, Jekyll is obviously much more constrained from a generic blog, from any blog and anything you could do when making a blog. So Jekyll is much more constrained in that sense. And then again, it gives you these benefits. So I think the thing why this conversation, it feels like maybe there's people talking past each other, or just people aren't meaning the same thing when we talk about whether Next is self-hostable or not, is that the constraints and the opinions in Next.js are there to give you the benefits of hosting on a sophisticated infrastructure like the one Vercel gives you. And yet you can self-host it. But exactly like you said, if you had a back office app that was 10 years old and did all sorts of file system writing, and then you made all these changes just to put it at Heroku, but you never use any of Heroku's benefits, it wouldn't be a good trade-off, right? You would like regret that refactoring and adopting those constraints because the benefits weren't there. So things like the default behavior of caching in Next, having to learn about revalidation, are all part of Next. They're not part of a new Rails app or a new dynamic, node app. If you made a route handler or a page that returned the new date and then you just refresh it, it's going to run every time. In Next, it doesn't. They might be changing that, but just as an example, to understand why those constraints exist, you do have to understand this infrastructure stuff and the benefits that it gives you, and if those benefits are something that you care about or not. Regardless, if you're using Next, you should understand them, right, because it helps understand why the design is the way it is. So let's talk about some of the specific opinions and constraints and how they lend themselves to an architecture like Vercel, and why if you just grab like a DigitalOcean server, install Node on it, and run npm run start, that's where people start to say, is it really self-hostable? It's kind of strange, right?
Right. I think the one that always comes up, and the one that kind of is like the linchpin of Next.js is not self-hostable, is this idea, the middleware.
Middleware is a great one to start with. Yep.
In Next.js supports middleware just like any other HTTP web framework you've used. When a request comes in, it first goes through this middleware layer. Middleware layer can basically do anything it wants to the request, can change it, can send out an early response before your app starts processing it. So I like to think of it as like a gateway into the application. It's a middleware. It sits between it's a middle between the client and the app code. In Next.js, you have to write middleware in Edge runtime JavaScript. And for those of you that don't know what this is, Next.js Vercel has a JavaScript runtime that they made. It looks like JavaScript. It runs JavaScript, but it's a subset of Node. It looks more like browser JavaScript than it does like Node.js. So you can't do things like import the FS module and read from the file system. You can't make a TCP or socket connection. Again, looks like JavaScript you'd see in the browser. Or yeah, JavaScript you'd see in the browser. And a lot
it's
of
running on the server side.
It's running on the server side. It's running in the middleware layer. All your middleware is authored in this. And a lot of people go to deploy and they say, well, I want my middleware to connect to my database and I want to do an auth check. If the URL has the word admin in it, I want to make sure they're an admin before letting them into the app. There's a common use case for middleware. And yeah, how do you connect to a database in a runtime that doesn't have socket connections? This is a hard problem to solve. You can like make a fetch request to, this is actually the way some people do it. They make a fetch request to an API route because that API route can run in Node.js. So it's like a silly way of importing Node code. You make a fetch request to it. It's super creative. And people get frustrated by this and they say it's not self-hostable. And I think there's the thing we want to ask is why? Why is Next.js limiting you this way? This seems like a really big limitation. So there must be a good reason for it. And there must be a reason that is not, they don't want you to self-host it. Right? What are they trying to nudge you towards? Heroku is telling you can't have a file system because they're trying to nudge you towards a slider that you can scale up and down your app. So what is Next.js trying to nudge you towards by running middleware that can't connect to your database? One of the benefits of this Edge runtime, the name of the runtime is called Edge runtime, this JavaScript runtime that Vercel offers. One of the benefits of it is it basically has no cold start time. So you can spin it up in a Lambda and it is fast. Once you want to spin it up, it's ready to go. If you take a Node.js, if you try to send Node.js to a Lambda and you want to spin it up, it can be extremely slow. We've had some of our Node code take as long as 8 seconds to load in a Lambda. There's a lot of things that are factored here, what version of Node you're on, how much code you're loading, how many dependencies you have installed, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, it can be pretty bad. But this Vercel runtime is instant. And if you have an instant runtime and it is not talking to your database, it's a constrained set of JavaScript, you can do things with it like you can run it anywhere in the world. It doesn't need to be close. Doesn't need to be close to your database. It can be on any computer. You can spin it up. A request comes in from Japan. You just spin up one of these middleware servers in Japan. Middleware looks at the requests and maybe it does something like, oh, you're accessing a URL that I changed. So I'm just going to redirect you to the new URL. And that request was able to stay in Japan.
You might be
Vercel might be running your application, your API routes in US East, but they were able to intercept that request in Japan, run the middleware in Japan, and quickly respond to it. Maybe you're not even running the middleware where the request is coming from. There's like another benefit here that is, let's say a request comes into your application in US East and you have some Node code that you want to load, but that's going to cold start. So that's going to take 8 seconds or so. But you could run the middleware also right there in US East with no cold start and basically very quickly make a decision. Do we want this request to continue? Because if you know the answer is like you don't want this request to continue, then why spend the 8 seconds doing the cold start? So this idea that you get like really cheap middleware that you can spin up and spin down, you can run anywhere in the world, or you can just run right next to your app, is what I think that what they're trying to nudge you towards by using this constrained subset of JavaScript. I think the problem with the self-hosting comes in here where people say, well, I don't have like a CDN layer where I can spin these things up. You know, it's the request already made it to my server. I have a long run Node process. I'm not running serverless. I just want to access Node and middleware. And that I think this is where like the confusion comes from. And I think I don't know. I think there's an interesting question for me here, which is when I look at like the Heroku 12 factors and like the container deployments, I basically think like these things have won in terms of like the backend Ruby, PHP apps. And so I should say, yeah, you should just do that. It's you'll be on a happy path if you do that. Anything you're giving. what it's a best practice, and anything you're giving up, like the tooling is so good that they make the give up not really feel like a give up. So like, yeah, that's all.
Yep.
There's, of course, there are arguments, like little caveats here, but for the most part, that's how I feel. With like this middleware example I just gave, I don't know that I certainly wouldn't tell someone like, I think this is like, oh, you should give it up, it's a best practice. I think it's really cool that you have a framework that basically says, hey, here's a box for middleware, and when you put code in this box, our framework is aware of this. So when you deploy to hosts like Vercel, we can tease that out and run it in a faster location. I think that's really cool. I love like framework code that influences infra code and vice versa. Infra that can influence framework design. I love how those two like grow together. But I don't know that I love the idea of like telling all developers like this is the equivalent of just give up, treat all your default storage as ephemeral storage, and try not to think about the file system. I feel like they're on two different levels, even though there's like benefits to both, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, that was great. Great explanation. I think it's a good example. And so just to like, because this is the first time me hearing like this week, just to kind of replay back. If you self-host a Next app and you run npm run start, when the middleware part runs, you can't import FS, not because of something Vercel has done once you deploy it. This is part of Next.js, the open source code. So when Next.js handles a request, sees that there's a middleware, and then runs the middleware, it's actually going to boot up, start the edge runtime, and then hand the middleware code off to that. So even if you were to buy a DigitalOcean server, install Node on it, and run npm run start, so you have full access to Node in this computer, in the server that you're running. When Next processes the middleware, it's going to use its bundled edge runtime, so you will still be limited, right? So to your point, the reason that this was a decision is because the framework wants to nudge folks to use a provider that is sophisticated enough to do things like tease apart the middlewares, deploy them elsewhere, right? Push them to the edge and have that handle everything. Because if you're just running a long-running server anyways, there's no reason to care about a cold start, right? And all of us writing Node code and all the Node modules on NPM over the last 15 years were written with the mindset, the same mindset that, you know, PHP and Ruby modules were written. You start up a server, and so the load time doesn't matter because you're going to run it, and it's going to just be loaded up into memory. Just like a native app developer doesn't care about startup time because they load the code and then they handle all the interactions along the way. So you imagine you would write code very differently if you had to launch the app every time you want to do an interaction. That's kind of what's happening here. And so the benefit is if you use sophisticated infra, you can do exactly the kinds of things you were saying. So that's why it's technically
Can I just add something there? And I don't want to dwell on this too much, but like the fact that you're able to write code in this fast running process means you're able to delegate the decision to the infra provider. You're not saying like, hey, infra provider, I want you to run it in this location or whatever. They get to choose, and you've given them a fast way to execute code, and they say, hey, you know what, I can do it fast over here, but maybe they don't. Maybe they do it next to your app server in a single region. But the idea is that like you delegate that decision to them the same way, I guess, like the Heroku analogy is, you delegate like how to start the Linux server. You don't really care you don't care like what distribution your app is running on or so on. You delegate that to them. Anyway, sorry, I didn't want to.
Yep. No, that's great. Is it self-hostable? Yes, right? Because it's literally going to work. Is there any sense in running npm run start just to have part of your app's request load a separate runtime that is optimized for cold starting when you're literally in a long-running DigitalOcean server just to handle this part of your request. No, that doesn't make any sense, right? That's like it feels like a mismatch between the tool and the job. So I think this is the stuff that is important to understand, because you want to know why you're taking on these constraints. And if you're not getting the benefits because you're using a hosting option that doesn't support them, then it's going to feel frustrating. It's going to be like, why am I giving this up? There's other options. There's other things in the framework that come to mind. Things like, using cookies and headers automatically opts a route into dynamic rendering, right? And a sophisticated enough host can tease apart the dynamic and static routes in your app. If it's a static route, we know that if a user visits this URL, again, we can push that out to edge CDNs. We don't have to do any compute. If this depends on search params or cookies or headers, we know we need to go back to an application server that's running that code, that has a node process, or that's close to origin or whatever. So that's just hopefully gives some color to a lot of these decisions that have come to Next. And I think at the beginning of Next was introduced, added server-side rendering. Then it had like this notion of a static export. And then it had a notion of blending these two. On a route-by-route basis, you could have static files and not. And that was pretty amazing, because we've been in situations where we've had like a fully dynamic, let's say a Rails app, or worked with people who have like a big dashboard, and then they have a marketing homepage that's static. Sometimes they even end up reaching for different technology to build their marketing homepage, because they would rather, again, give up any dynamic bits so that the homepage was extremely fast. So if someone went to intercom.com, they get the homepage fast. They don't need to load up all the Ember code that's powering the dashboard, right? That makes sense. So people would actually use different tools for those pages.
Yeah, there's like always a tell where if like someone had a domain and then when you log in, you go to like app.domain.com.
Exactly.
It's always a tell that like they want to use two stacks for this. And
Exactly.
you are right in the sense that like if you're able to tell Next through user access and cookies or headers, which parts are dynamic, which parts are static, there's a nice benefit here. It can tease these things apart, and you don't feel like you have to pick a new tech stack.
You don't have to start a new app just to make a static homepage. And so that was kind of like how Next and other platforms too, other frameworks too, have evolved, where they've added tools and APIs that provided you're using sophisticated enough infrastructure, they can take advantage of those hints. And now you can have a static homepage that can be pushed out without you having to like, code splitting is route-based code splitting is another example of this. So that is kind of how I look at Next evolution and some other frameworks as well. And you can imagine like if I had a Rails app and the homepage doesn't have any controller method, no instance variables, no database requests, no auth checks. The homepage is literally just an ERB file with HTML. Wouldn't it be cool if Heroku could, serve that up as a static thing? It didn't have to touch my app or whatever. It could be served around the world and edge CDNs. That'd be cool. That's kind of like the experiment that Vercel and Next have been trying to do, and again, other tools as well. And I think it's interesting, but it's also not always clear which particular parts, what are the factors, what are the constraints, and what are we giving up. So,
and what are we getting?
And what are we getting? Exactly. And is what we're getting something that we even care about or need? And for what we're giving up. So for example, the auth check on middleware, like what are we giving up? Well, you have to figure out some other way to do this now. Like this is normally done in a middleware layer if you want to just protect everything under admin. So how are you going to do this? That's like the cost, right? You have to figure out how else you're going to do this. You might have also seen on Twitter some of the Next APIs like search params becoming async, so that you need to await them to get the search params or the params in a route. And the question is why? Because if you're thinking about a traditional server-side rendered app, the request comes in. Don't you have the params? Shouldn't you just be able to access them? Again, this is another hint to the infra that work can be done separately between these two routes, one that needs the search params, one that doesn't. And this relates to PPR. It's basically all under this umbrella of how can we pull out the static parts of our app, and so that we can use a sophisticated infrastructure to get the static parts to the user faster, right?
Yeah, I mean that is Next's goal. I think there's
Yes.
like a level up here, which is frameworks that tie into infra, and what is the relationship between frameworks and infra. I think for a long time we've felt that you should be able to run an application, and if I can like build a Docker container, I can send that thing to any host and they can host it, and there's a very clear line between the host's responsibility and my container's responsibility.
Right.
My container my code isn't doing things like awaiting get search params for the sake of signaling something to the host that the host like, hey, you might be able to optimize this.
Right. The container is the boundary.
The container is a boundary. And, I probably put myself in the camp, like very old, boring tech. I like containers. I like that the container is a boundary. And that's how that's like, those are the apps I want to work on, right? But there's part of me that also like really appreciates that, like, it's not that infra evolves alone. It evolves with your framework. And a framework and infra that are talking together are like, yeah, there's some unlocks there. And
absolutely some unlocks. There's also, but I think there's also real costs to complexity, real costs to understanding things that I think could be made a little bit more clear.
This is a part. This is a part where we need to say, like, we're trying to be doctors here and analyze it, and because we can't tell you which is better or not.
Exactly. The point of this is not to try to argue one is better than the other, because it's just to explain a lot of the confusion and the frustration we've seen, I think, is because these trade-offs are not being clearly made. And so even though Next.js does support the container boundary, the problem is if you deploy it on any container provider, you won't get the same performance characteristics that you would if you deployed it to a more sophisticated infrastructure. Whereas if you think about a Rails app abiding by the 12 factors, you would expect it to perform and behave very similarly if you put it on DigitalOcean, if you put it on Heroku or Amazon or Google Cloud. Whereas if you take a Next app and you make it containerized, it does support it. It will technically work, but it's going to behave differently and more strangely than you would expect in certain providers than others.
Yeah.
And so that's why people would say, yeah, basically you can tell me it's self-hostable because I can run npm run start, but the reality is it's not, because there's all these things that I've done in my app that really only make sense with a sophisticated infra. And so if I'm not going to do that myself, then it's basically effectively not self-hostable.
You feel like you've been tricked into.
Yes.
I can npm start, but I can't. By the way, I want to yes and your Rails and Next thing. These are both explicit decisions that the framework authors have made. In DHH's latest talk, which is fantastic, it's a design goal that is the boundary in Rails. Rails is not ever going to peak out and require certain infra to exist. And then I think the opposite end of that, you have something like Next. It's like, look, like, peek out, come out, like, let us know about what your code is doing, and we can optimize that. And there's trade-offs across both of those, but
trade-offs across both. You're never going to set up a CDN. Yes,
it's a philosophy of the frameworks.
Yep. I think, on the one hand, you have Next and Vercel, which can say you're never going to have to worry about setting up a CDN. On the other, you have Rails, which is going to give you an API like Russian doll caching, which you can use to do something like make the homepage faster. And then now you can set up a Fastly or something like that to push that into that. And you'll be able to host it in more places and get the same performance characteristics. But yeah, the providers are not going to be peeking into the code. So anyways, all this conversation was just about trying to, it's an interesting thought experiment, going back from when frameworks like early Next and Gatsby and other things provided APIs that the app developer used, so that when you deploy it, you can make things faster, you can deploy it more smartly, you can take advantage of new benefits that infrastructure providers give us. And so that line between infra and app code is kind of bleeding over. And while on the other hand, you have something like Rails where you're not going to have to think about how fast this might be, because you're going to get the request, you're going to get the params, you can connect to the database, and it's going to be very easy to write those apps because those boundaries are very clear. And yeah, for a lot of apps, maybe if you're not having to think about that, I mean, that's a huge benefit to not have to think about that, in the same way that, you know, and it's like you said, this is all like a gradient, not having to think about which factors, which constraints I have to abide by, is a benefit. I think the thing I would like to see, both from Next, but also from any other, there's other decisions like this in other frameworks. For example, Remix, with the reloading of the parent layout, rerunning the parent layout, right? Anytime you use a framework that has like partial page reloads, it behaves differently from like a traditional like whole page refresh. So there's times where you have to tell Remix, you know, we changed something and now we need to rerun the parent layout. But by default, maybe the parent layout doesn't re-render. Why is that? Why is that a constraint I'm taking on by the way I'm writing my app, and what's the benefit for it? So I think with all of these new, like newer frameworks and libraries and the way they nudge you certain ways, if they're doing it for a benefit, for a reason, and it seems confusing, the best thing to do as a developer is to understand that, to understand the benefit you're getting, and that can help you make the best decision for whatever problem you have on which tool to use, which framework to use, which API to use even. Yeah.
Cool. What do you think, as frameworks make these trade-offs, how do you think, like, what's the best way for them to talk about them? Is this like an education problem and this stuff needs to be talked about more? Or is this more of, well, in 10 years from now, there's going to be like 4 more Vercels and they're all going to understand your Next.js app, and eventually the rest of the world will catch up and you'll have different hosting options, I guess.
Right.
And I don't really know what I'm asking here, but yeah.
Yep. I think it's definitely an education problem. You know, if you look at like the first versions of like the SSG, the JAMstack stuff, what did infra hosts need to do? How sophisticated they need to get? Well, they just needed to know that there was a public folder, right? That's what the configuration was about. If you have a public folder that's a result of your build, then we're going to be able to put it out on a CDN for you, and you won't have to set up anything, let's say. That's a pretty easy ask, you know, for an infra provider. Things like looking to see whether you use headers or cookies, or, you know, knowing you're running Next and pulling out your header, your middleware.ts files and being able to put them. That's a different ask. So I think this stuff is a spectrum. To answer your question, I think it's an education thing. I think Heroku's 12-factor app stuff was very, very good because it made it crystal clear the trade-off you were making, whether the benefits were worth it for your team, and exactly what you were giving up. I think both Next and other frameworks should basically do the same thing. And instead of just saying, yes, you can put your Next app into a container and deploy it, I think there's more to it than that. Basically, this conversation that if you were going to self-host Next, which again is self-hostable, what are the different characteristics between self-hosting it that you might not expect if you are used to self-hosting WordPress or self-hosting Rails or self-hosting some other framework?
Cool. I think another question I have is like, half-formed question here, but like, is it better for a framework? I know we're pathfinding and we're figuring this stuff out, but is it better for a framework to like, these are decisions we're making, and like not even tell you that you can self-host it in the Next.js example? Basically, like, we think these things are so important that we want you to use a web host. Now, of course, you can still self-host it, but there's a lot you're giving up.
You had a great analogy when we were talking about this week, which was you can use Rails and not use Active Record. You can do that. You can make a Rails app, not use Rails, a database, and not use Active Record, and use some other architecture for your persistence. The question is, like, are you really using Rails at that point? I mean, no, yes, I feel like a Rails developer, but a Rails developer would say you're not using it in the spirit it was meant to be used. And so you're going to be framework fighting, and there's probably a better option if what you need is not suited by Active Record and Rails, right? If there's really a problem that is not solved, you'd be better off either learning how to use Active Record for your problem, or probably finding something else. Because if you're going to use Rails and not use Active Record and not use a database, you're going to be framework fighting all over the place. This is what the tool was designed for. So I think, again, to your question of like, should frameworks, how should they talk about this? I think there's a spectrum here where, okay, containers have won. Ephemeral file storage has won. So we have Google, we have Amazon S3, and we're just telling you that's why we do this, because this is like a pretty established best practice. There's lots of services for this. It's become standard in the industry. Whereas maybe some of the more experimental stuff we're seeing, how to push parts of your dynamic code to, edge runtimes, or how to take static parts of a dynamic page and separate it from maybe that's more experimental. Yeah. And so this is where we're going, because this is what we think is important. We think this is the best way to build apps. We think this will be the best, but it's a little bit earlier. It's a little bit more experimental. Those are all things you should understand if you want to self-host a Next, right? Or self-host a framework that does this. So I think I think it's really mostly communication education that people should understand. And you can imagine, if you're going to go, if your friend told you to use Rails and told you to remove Active Record and then start writing a Rails app, and you're looking at the documentation for Rails and it's telling you how to create a post and create comments, but you can't use any of the Active Record APIs, you're going to be really frustrated. And if Rails docs had nothing that didn't say anything about that, or like, you deployed Rails to a provider and like it didn't support database connections, and so your Active Record didn't work, and you have to figure out a different way to like query your backend, you're going to be really, really frustrated. So if Rails apps had that characteristic, you would want to see it in the docs. Hey, by the way, if you deploy somewhere without this or that, these APIs exist because we're expecting you to deploy it to infra that is this sophisticated, that has these capabilities. But if you don't, you should, if that was a common path, you should know this is what you're giving up. So I think it's mostly communication. Again, that 12-factor app post was really, really good. And there's just, it's like you said, it's on the one hand, it's fascinating, all of the little decisions and the opinions and the APIs, the hints that are able to be in Next, the framework level that the app developer can use, because the whole thesis here, which we've talked about many times, like the app developer knows best about whether a page needs to be real time, needs to be fresh, whether it's more important for the home page to be static because my CEO told me it needs to be really fast when someone clicks a link from Twitter. We need an open graph image that's fresh, or we want it to be that whole scale. Yeah. Having a tool that lets you slide that, at the page level, at even the component level, it's fascinating. But on the other hand, if you don't understand that, then it would be like trying to use Rails without Active Record, and you're going to have a bad time. So I think that's kind of where we landed after talking about all this. but it definitely clarified it for me, both for Next and for other tools. Just thinking about those constraints. We've talked about this before, just trying to understand, get in the heads of the library author. Why do they make you do things a certain way? Is it because of performance issues? Is it because they want to nudge you, to, why does use effect behave the way it does? Because they want to nudge you to make sure you have a single source of truth. So it's kind of in the same category. But I think that's kind of what we wanted to say about it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one thing I realized during this conversation too. It's very easy to look back on all like previous framework infra decisions from like 20 years ago and the last 20 years. And you just think like, oh, of course that idea was the best idea because it's the one that won, right? So it's not really, but like now we're kind of we're in this newer era where we don't know and we're still figuring it out. And so, yeah. It's just very, cause like, I don't know, the way people, even me, the way people talk about infra, it's very like matter of fact, like this is the way it should work. This is the way it does work. But yeah, we are figuring out infra is not a solved problem and frameworks are not a solved problem. And those two things will, I hope continue to evolve forever and
influence each other.
Influence each other, right. And this idea that like, oh, it ends at the container. I'm happy with that, but other people saying, no, we can push it further is a good thing. It's a great thing.
Yep. So that's great little takeaway. Yeah. I was just thinking of like, hosted SQLite, like that was not a thing that existed. Maybe that would change how people thought about making a Rails app, a test app, preview deploys. That could change, it could change a lot. It could change about how you write an app, how you share it with your team, how you do preview deploys for a stateful app. Yeah, I think that's an interesting nugget that we really were excited to talk about, how this conversation between infra and apps architecture is evolving. And it seems like they're going to continue to influence each other. It's good to understand the constraints that a particular infra solution has so that or application framework has, so you know what you're giving up, what you're getting. But yeah, that's about it. So Next is self-hostable. Cool. All right, I got to go to a meeting. Let's wrap it up there. Maybe if folks have follow-ups, we kind of wanted to just spitball this, get this all out. But I think we'll be thinking more about this, especially with like things like PPR coming out, which is basically like that feels like an evolution on architecture for deploying like a React app, which is pretty interesting. I know there's some stuff coming to React for that, so that would be really interesting to see. But I think that's it for this week. So if you have any questions, hit us up, frontendfirstfm on Twitter. You can email us, sam@buildui or ryan@buildui.com. And thanks for listening.
Cool. See ya.
All right. See you next week. Bye.